The first time he called me, Mom, it was a whisper, a slip of the tongue so quiet I thought I had imagined it. He was a young man, barely in his 20s, with eyes that seemed to hold a quiet sadness, a depth of feeling that was unusual for someone his age. His name was Leo, and he had started coming into the community library where I volunteered 3 afternoons a week. He would find the most secluded armchair, the one tucked away behind the history section, and read for hours, never bothering anyone. There was a gentleness about him, a respectful silence that I found comforting. On that particular day, the library was unusually busy. Children were running between the shelves, their high-pitched laughter echoing off the tall ceilings, and a group of teenagers were huddled around a computer, their conversation a low, energetic buzz. I was trying to reshelve a cart of books, my arms overloaded, when a heavy collection of art history tomes began to slide from the top of the pile. Before I could even react, a pair of strong, young hands were there, steadying the stack. "Let me help you with that," a soft voice said. It was Leo. He had abandoned his quiet corner to come to my aid. "Oh, thank you, dear," I said, my voice filled with relief. "These old books seem to get heavier every year." He smiled, a rare and beautiful thing that lit up his entire face. "It's no problem. Where are they going?" I pointed to a high shelf. "Just up there. I usually need the step stool, but my knees have been complaining about it lately." He reached up with effortless grace, placing the heavy books back in their proper place. His movements were careful, precise. When he was done, he turned back to me, and that's when it happened. "There you go, Mom, all safe and sound." The word hung in the air between us for a fraction of a second. His eyes widened in horror as he realized what he had said. A deep blush spread from his neck to his cheeks. "Oh my gosh," he stammered, his hands flying up as if to catch the word and stuff it back into his mouth. "I am so sorry. I don't know why I said that. I meant to say, ma'am, I'm so sorry. I couldn't help but smile, a genuine, warm smile that seemed to surprise him. I reached out and placed a hand gently on his arm. His muscles were tense with embarrassment. "It's quite all right," I said, my voice soft. "Please, don't worry about it. It was an easy mistake to make." He still looked mortified. "No, it's not. I'm so sorry." "Leo," I said, making sure to use his name. "It's perfectly fine. Really, I appreciate your help more than you know." He finally lowered his hands, though the blush lingered on his face. He nodded, unable to meet my eyes, and then quickly retreated back to his armchair in the history section, burying his face in his book. I watched him go, a strange feeling fluttering in my chest. It had been years since anyone had called me Mom with that kind of unthinking casualness. My own son, Daniel, was a grown man with a wife and a demanding career in a city hundreds of miles away. When he called me, which was not as often as I would have liked, he called me Mom, of course, but it was different. It was the title of a role, a label. It didn't have the same warmth, the same unconscious affection that had just slipped from this young man's lips. I tried to dismiss it, to go back to my work, but the word echoed in my mind. Mom. For the rest of the afternoon, I found my eyes drifting over to the history section, to the boy with the sad eyes and the quiet demeanor. I wondered about his own mother. Where was she? Did he see her often? Did he help her with heavy books? The questions settled in my heart, planting a seed of curiosity that I knew would be difficult to ignore. My life had become a quiet, orderly thing since my husband, Robert, had passed away 5 years ago. My days were measured by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, the rising and setting of the sun, and the predictable rhythm of my volunteer shifts. The silence in my house was a constant companion, a heavy blanket that I had grown accustomed to. Daniel and his wife, Sarah, were busy. I understood that. They had their own lives, their own struggles. But their absence had carved out a hollow space inside me, a place that ached with a loneliness I rarely admitted, even to myself. That evening, as I sat at my small kitchen table, eating a solitary dinner of soup and toast, I thought about Leo. I thought about the sheer panic in his eyes when he'd made his verbal slip. It was more than just embarrassment over a social blunder. It was something deeper, something pained. It was as if the word itself was a wound. The following day, I returned to the library for my Thursday shift. I wasn't sure if he would be there. I half expected him to be so embarrassed that he would find a new place to read. But as I walked through the doors, I saw him, already settled in his usual armchair, a thick book open on his lap. He glanced up when I came in, and for a moment, I saw that familiar flicker of anxiety in his eyes. He gave me a small, hesitant nod. I smiled back, a warm, reassuring smile, and went about my duties at the front desk. I decided to give him his space, to pretend as if nothing had happened. I didn't want to make him feel uncomfortable. But as the hours passed, I felt a strange pull, a desire to connect with him beyond our brief, awkward encounter. It was a foolish thought for a woman of 68. What could I possibly have in common with a young man in his 20s? My best friend, Martha, would have a field day with it. "Clara," she'd say in her no-nonsense voice, "you're a lonely old woman. Don't go adopting a stray puppy just because he looks sad." Martha was practical to a fault, but she wasn't wrong. I was lonely, and maybe Leo was just a sad-looking stray. But as the afternoon wore on, an opportunity presented itself. I had made a pot of herbal tea in the small staff break room, a fragrant chamomile blend that I found soothing. On a whim, I poured a second cup. Carrying the 2 mugs carefully, I made my way back to the history section. Leo looked up, surprised, as I approached. "I made some tea," I said, my voice casual. "I thought you might like a cup. It gets a bit chilly back in this corner." He stared at the steaming mug as if I had offered him a bar of gold. "Oh," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't," I replied gently, "but I wanted to, no strings attached." I placed the mug on the small table beside his chair. "It's just chamomile. I hope that's all right." He finally looked up at me, and in his eyes, I saw a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. It was a mixture of gratitude and confusion, and something else, something that looked like a deep, unspoken sorrow. "Thank you," he said, his fingers wrapping around the warm ceramic. "Thank you very much, Clara." He used my name. I had a name tag on my blouse, of course, but it felt significant that he had made the effort to read it and use it. It felt like a small step toward something, though I wasn't sure what. I simply nodded and went back to my desk, feeling a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the tea. From that day on, a quiet routine began to form between us. I would bring him a cup of tea during my shift, and he would accept it with that same look of quiet gratitude. Sometimes, we would exchange a few words. I learned that he was new in town, that he was looking for work, and that he loved history books, particularly those about ancient civilizations. He learned that I had been a teacher before I retired, and that my husband had been the one who had instilled in me a love for the quiet comfort of libraries. Our conversations were always brief, superficial, but they became the anchor of my week. I found myself looking forward to my volunteer days with an eagerness I hadn't felt in years. I would bake cookies or a small loaf of banana bread, always making a little extra to wrap up for Leah. He would protest at first, insisting that I shouldn't, but the way his eyes lit up told me that my small offerings meant something to him. He was thin, I noticed. His clothes, though always clean, seemed a size too big for his slender frame. I worried that he wasn't eating properly. The maternal instinct that had been stirred by his slip of the tongue was now growing stronger, taking root in the fertile soil of my loneliness. One rainy Tuesday, about a month after our first meeting, he came into the library looking soaked to the bone. He wasn't wearing a jacket, and his thin shirt was plastered to his skin. He was shivering, his face pale. "Good heavens, Leo," I exclaimed, rushing out from behind the desk. "You'll catch your death of cold. Where is your coat?" He shrugged, avoiding my gaze as he tried to slick his wet hair back from his forehead. "I don't have one," he said quietly. "I'm fine, I'll dry off." But he didn't look fine. He looked miserable and cold. I couldn't bear it. "You come with me right now," I said, my voice firm but gentle. I led him into the small, warm break room, ignoring the questioning look from the head librarian, Mrs. Gable. I made him sit down while I bustled around, finding a clean towel from the supply closet and making him a hot, sweet cup of tea. "Here," I said, handing him the towel. "Dry your hair at least, and drink this, all of it." He did as he was told, like an obedient child. He huddled over the warm mug, his shivering slowly subsiding. I found myself looking at him, really looking at him. There was something about the shape of his face, the curve of his brow, that felt familiar. It was a fleeting feeling, like a half-remembered dream, and I couldn't quite grasp it. "You need a coat, Leo," I said softly. "The weather is turning. Winter will be here before we know it." He nodded, still looking down at his tea. "I know, I've been looking for work. As soon as I get a job, a coat is the first thing on my list." My heart ached for him. He was so young to be so alone and struggling. Before I could stop myself, the words were out of my mouth. "I have my husband's old coats packed away in the attic. He was a bit broader than you, but one of them might fit well enough to keep you warm. They're just gathering dust. I'd be happy for one of them to have a new life." He looked up at me, his eyes wide and shining with unshed tears. "Clara," he whispered, "you are too kind to me. I don't understand why." I sat down in the chair across from him, my hands folded on the small table. "My own son lives very far away," I said, the admission tasting like a confession. "He has his own life. I don't get to fuss over him very much anymore. I suppose you're just getting the brunt of a lonely old woman's maternal instincts." I tried to make it sound like a joke, but there was a truth in it that was sharp and painful. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on my face. "I don't think you're a lonely old woman," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I think you're the kindest person I've ever met." We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the gentle hum of the library outside the door. And then it happened again. He had finished his tea and stood up to place the mug in the sink. He turned to thank me again, a small, grateful smile on his face. "Really, thank you for everything, Mom." This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was spoken clearly, softly, with an air of absolute naturalness. He froze the instant the word left his lips, his smile vanishing, replaced by that same look of sheer panic I had seen weeks before. But this time, something was different. It didn't feel like a mistake. It felt intentional. It felt like a test, a question he was asking without words. My heart gave a painful thud in my chest. I looked into his sad, frightened eyes, and I knew that Martha's voice of caution was a distant echo, drowned out by the overwhelming surge of emotion I felt for this lost boy. I realized in that moment that this was about more than just a slip of the tongue. It was about a deep, unspoken need in both of us, a void that we had somehow, inexplicably, found in each other. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that it wasn't a mistake at all. I held his gaze, my expression calm and gentle. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him it was all right. I simply let the words settle in the quiet space between us, acknowledging it with a small, slow nod. The panic in his eyes subsided, replaced by a look of profound, heart-wrenching relief. He seemed to understand that I had heard not just the word, but the meaning behind it. He had called out for a mother, and in the silence of that tiny break room, I had answered. He didn't say anything else. He just gave me another small, grateful nod and slipped out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the echo of a word that was beginning to change the very fabric of my quiet, orderly life. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went up to the attic. It was a place of ghosts, a repository of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The air was thick with the scent of dust and cedar and memories. In the far corner, under a white sheet, were Robert's things. Boxes of his books, his old fishing gear, and several large storage containers filled with his clothes. I opened the one labeled winter coats. The familiar scent of his cologne, faint but still present, rose up to meet me. It was a bittersweet aroma that brought a lump to my throat. I pulled out a dark gray wool coat. It was a classic, well-made garment and still in perfect condition. Robert had always taken such good care of his things. It was warm and heavy, a fortress against the cold. As I held it, I pictured Leo wearing it. The image felt right. It didn't feel like a betrayal of Robert's memory. It felt like a continuation of his kindness. Robert had been a generous man. He would have approved. He would have been the first one to offer the boy a coat and a hot meal. The next day, I brought the coat to the library in a garment bag. I waited until the end of my shift when the library was quiet again. I found Leo in his usual spot, lost in a book. "Leo," I said softly. He looked up and his eyes fell on the bag in my hand. He knew what it was. A complicated mix of emotions played across his face: gratitude, reluctance, and something that looked like shame. "I don't know if I can accept this," he said, his voice low. "It's too much." "Nonsense," I said briskly, trying to keep the mood light. "It's a coat. It's meant to be worn, not to sit in a box in my attic. Please, just try it on. If it doesn't fit, no harm done. We'll just say it was a failed experiment." Hesitantly, he stood up and took the bag from me. He unzipped it and drew out the heavy wool coat. He slid his arms into the sleeves, and for a moment he just stood there, his back to me, his shoulders hunched. When he turned around, the coat was buttoned up to his chin. It was a little big in the shoulders, as I had expected, but otherwise it fit him remarkably well. It made him look older, more substantial. It gave him an air of dignity that I hadn't seen before, but it was the look in his eyes that struck me the most. He was staring down at the coat, his hand stroking the soft wool, with an expression of such raw, vulnerable longing that it almost broke my heart. "It's very warm," he whispered, finally looking up at me. His eyes were shining. "Thank you, Clara. I don't have the words." "You don't need them," I said gently. "Just promise me you'll wear it." "I will," he said, his voice thick. "I promise." After that day, the dynamic between us shifted again. The last vestiges of his shyness seemed to melt away, replaced by a quiet confidence. He started talking more, sharing little pieces of his life. He told me he was from a small town a few states over, that he had come here looking for a fresh start. He was vague about the reasons, and I never pushed. I knew he would tell me when he was ready. He started helping me more around the library, not just with heavy books, but with organizing shelves, tidying up the children's section, and even helping me figure out the new computer system that had been giving me so much trouble. He was smart and quick to learn. Mrs. Gable, the head librarian, was impressed. She even started letting him take on small, unpaid tasks, pleased to have the extra help. It felt like we were building something, a fragile, unspoken thing that resembled a family. He was the quiet, dutiful son I saw 3 times a week, and I was the mother who fussed over him with tea and cookies and a warm coat. It filled a void in me that I hadn't realized was so vast. But with this newfound closeness came a deepening of the mystery that surrounded him. The sense of familiarity I felt when I looked at him grew stronger. Sometimes, when he was concentrating on a task, the way his brow furrowed, or the way he would chew on his lower lip, would trigger a flash of déjà vu so intense it would make me pause. I was sure I had seen those mannerisms before, but I couldn't place where or when. I also couldn't ignore the sadness that still clung to him like a shadow. There were moments when he would stare off into the distance, his expression so filled with sorrow that it was a physical presence in the room. In those moments, I wanted to reach out, to put my arms around him and tell him that everything would be all right, but I held back. I didn't know the source of his pain, and I hadn't yet earned the right to offer that level of comfort. One afternoon, I decided to call my son Daniel. I felt a sudden, urgent need to connect with him, to hear his voice. Maybe it was seeing Leo in his father's coat that did it. It made me think about the passage of time, about the bonds that tie a family together, and the distances that can pull them apart. Sarah, my daughter-in-law, answered the phone. Her voice was bright and efficient as always. "Clara, hi, is everything okay?" Her tone immediately implied that the only reason I would call on a weekday afternoon was if there was an emergency. "Everything is fine, dear," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "I was just thinking of you both and wanted to say hello. Is Daniel there?" "He's in a meeting," she said quickly. "It's a crazy day here. We're in the middle of a huge project launch. Is it important?" "No, not at all," I said, the familiar sting of disappointment pricking at me. "Just a social call. How is the project going?" I listened as she talked about her work, about their busy schedules, about a dinner party they had attended over the weekend. I made the appropriate murmurs of interest, but my mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about the easy silence I shared with Leo, the comfortable companionship that required so few words. "Well, I should let you go," Sarah said after a few minutes, her voice already sounding distracted. I've got another call coming in. I'll tell Daniel you called. We'll try to call you this weekend. That would be lovely, dear, I said. I love you. You too, bye. And then she was gone. I hung up the phone and stood in the silence of my hallway, the grandfather clock ticking steadily beside me. I knew they were busy. I knew they loved me in their own way. But their love felt like a distant star, a faint light in a vast, dark sky. The warmth I felt from Leo, a virtual stranger, was like a small, steady flame, close enough to feel, real enough to chase away the chill. It was in that moment that I made a decision. I needed to understand who Leo was. It wasn't just idle curiosity anymore. It was a need, a deep-seated pull to understand the strange, familiar connection I felt to him. I wasn't going to pry or invade his privacy, but I was going to pay closer attention, to listen more carefully to the things he said and the things he left unsaid. My quiet, orderly life was over. A mystery had walked into it, wearing my husband's coat and calling me Mom, and I was determined to solve it. My first attempts at uncovering more about Leo were subtle, almost subconscious. During our brief conversations, I started to gently probe, asking seemingly innocuous questions about the town he came from, the school he went to, the kind of things he enjoyed doing as a child. His answers were always polite but frustratingly vague. His hometown was just a small place, you probably wouldn't have heard of it. His school was nothing special. He liked to read and spend time outdoors. He was a master of the nonspecific answer, deflecting my inquiries with a gentle skill that suggested he was well-practiced in keeping his past to himself. This evasiveness only deepened my conviction that there was a story there, a significant one he was not yet willing to share. My friend Martha, of course, remained my steadfast voice of cynical reason. We met for our weekly lunch at a small cafe downtown, a ritual we had maintained for over 20 years. I had been telling her about Leo in bits and pieces, carefully editing the more emotional aspects of our connection, but she was sharp. She could read between the lines of my carefully constructed sentences. So, this boy is still hanging around the library? She asked, taking a delicate sip of her tea. Martha did everything delicately, a stark contrast to her blunt way of speaking. He's not hanging around, Martha, I corrected her gently. He's a wonderful help. Mrs. Gable is even thinking of offering him a part-time job shelving books once the budget gets approved. And you gave him Robert's winter coat. She raised a skeptical eyebrow. He didn't have one, he was freezing. I defended my actions, though I knew it was pointless. Martha set her cup down with a soft click. Clara, listen to me. I know your heart is in the right place. I know you're lonely. Daniel and Sarah are, well, they are what they are. But you are letting a complete stranger into your life. You know nothing about him. He could be anyone. He could be a grifter, preying on a lonely widow. He is not a grifter, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He has never asked me for a single thing. I'm the one offering him tea and baked goods. I'm the one who gave him the coat. And that's how it starts, she insisted. They gain your trust with their sad stories and their polite manners, and the next thing you know, they're convincing you to invest in a can't-miss business opportunity, or they need a loan to help their poor, sick aunt who doesn't actually exist. He's not like that, I said, though a small, traitorous seed of doubt took root in my mind. Was I being naive? Was my own loneliness clouding my judgment, making me see what I wanted to see instead of what was really there? I tried to push the thought away. My intuition, a faculty I had trusted my entire life, told me that Leo was genuine. The sadness in his eyes was real. The gratitude he expressed felt sincere. Still, Martha's words lingered, a cautionary whisper in the back of my mind. The days turned into weeks. Autumn began its slow, colorful surrender to the starkness of winter. Leo wore Robert's gray coat every day, and the sight of it never failed to stir a complex mix of emotions in me. He had found a part-time job washing dishes at a local restaurant in the evenings, but he still spent his afternoons at the library. The work seemed to tire him out. His face was often etched with fatigue, but he never complained. Our routine continued. Tea, conversation, and the comfortable silence of two people who enjoyed each other's company. One blustery afternoon, he was helping me sort through a box of donated books in the library's back room. Many of them were old, their pages yellowed and brittle. As he lifted a stack of novels, a smaller, leather-bound book fell from the pile and landed on the floor. It was a photo album, old and worn. "Oh, be careful with that," I said, bending down to pick it up. "It looks fragile." The clasp was broken, and as I picked it up, it fell open. The first page was a photograph of a young woman with a bright, hopeful smile, her hair styled in a way that was popular 50 years ago. She was standing next to a young man in a university sweater. I froze. I knew that sweater. I knew that building in the background. And I knew the young woman. It was me. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the image, my mind reeling. It was a photograph from my first year of college. I had no memory of this particular picture being taken, and I certainly didn't own a copy of it. I couldn't imagine how it had ended up in a box of donated books. "Is everything all right, Clara?" Leo's voice broke through my shock. He was looking at me with concern, his eyes fixed on the open album in my hands. I'm fine," I stammered, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's just this is a picture of me from a very long time ago." He moved closer, his gaze dropping to the photograph. He looked at the young woman, then back up at my face, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Wow," he said softly, "that's you." "It is," I whispered, my fingers trembling as I traced the outline of my younger self. Then my eyes shifted to the young man beside me in the photo. His arm was casually slung over my shoulder. He had a charming, roguish grin. His name was Michael O'Connell. He had been a friend, a classmate. We had been part of the same study group. He had been smart and funny, and for a brief time I had thought I might have feelings for him. But then I met Robert, and Michael had faded into the background of my memories, just another face from a life lived long ago. How had this picture, a picture of me and Michael, found its way here now? It was too much of a coincidence. "Do you know who donated this box of books?" I asked Mrs. Gable later, trying to keep my voice steady. She adjusted her glasses and peered at the box. "Let me see. There should be a slip. Ah, here it is. It was an anonymous donation. Someone just left it in the overnight drop box last week." Anonymous? The word did little to calm my racing thoughts. I took the photo album home with me that evening, a clear violation of library policy, but I couldn't help it. I needed to look at it, to study it, to understand where it had come from. Sitting in my favorite armchair, the one Robert used to occupy, I turned the brittle pages. The album was filled with pictures from that same era. Pictures of the university campus, of students laughing and studying. And on almost every page, there was Michael O'Connell. It seemed to be his personal album. There were pictures of him with his family, at sporting events with a group of friends. And tucked in between them, there were 3 more pictures of me. One of me laughing in the campus cafeteria. One of me studying in the library, unaware of the camera. And the one from the first page, the 2 of us together. A strange, unsettling feeling washed over me. It felt like I was looking at a story I had only been partially aware of. In these photos, captured through Michael's lens, it seemed he saw me as more than just a friend from his study group. There was an intimacy, a focus in the way he had photographed me that I had been completely oblivious to at the time. I went to bed that night feeling deeply unsettled. The past had reached out and touched me in a way that felt both random and deeply significant. The next day at the library, I watched Leo with new eyes. I was looking for something, a sign, a clue, though I didn't know what it would be. I studied the way he moved, the expressions on his face, searching for a hint of Michael O'Connell in him. But there was nothing. They didn't look alike. Their mannerisms were different. Michael had been confident, outgoing. Leo was quiet, introspective. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that the appearance of that photo album at this specific time was somehow connected to him. It was a wild, illogical leap, the kind of thinking Martha would have mercilessly mocked. But the coincidence was too great to ignore. A week passed, and the mystery of the photo album remained unsolved. It sat on my coffee table, a tangible piece of a puzzle I couldn't assemble. My interactions with Leo continued as before, but there was a new layer of complexity to my feelings. My maternal affection was now mixed with a current of suspicion, a quiet unease that I tried my best to hide. Then came the day he disappeared. I arrived for my Tuesday shift, my tote bag filled with a fresh batch of oatmeal raisin cookies, and looked for him in his usual spot. The armchair was empty. I felt a small pang of disappointment, but assumed he was just running late. But as the hours ticked by and he didn't appear, the disappointment curdled into worry. It was not like him to miss a day without saying anything. By the time my shift ended, a cold knot of dread had formed in my stomach. I told myself I was being ridiculous. He was a grown man. He probably just had something else to do. He didn't owe me an explanation for his whereabouts. But he didn't come on Thursday either. Or the following Tuesday. He was gone. He had vanished from my life as quietly as he had entered it. The empty armchair in the history section became a monument to his absence. The silence in the library was no longer comforting. It was heavy, filled with unanswered questions. I called the restaurant where he worked, my heart pounding as I asked the manager if Leo was there. Leo. The man's gruff voice answered. Nah, he quit. Didn't even give notice. Just stopped showing up last week. Left me in a real bind, the kid did. He had quit his job. My worry intensified, morphing into genuine fear. Where had he gone? Was he okay? Had something terrible happened to him? The mother in me imagined the worst. An accident, an illness, trouble. But Martha's cynical voice whispered a different possibility in my ear. Maybe he had simply moved on. Maybe he had gotten what he wanted, a warm coat, some free meals, and had left to find his next target. Maybe this was the scam she had warned me about, a slow, patient con designed to win my affection before the inevitable disappearance. The thought was so painful I could barely breathe. Had I been a fool? Had I projected all my loneliness and longing onto a complete stranger, creating a fantasy of a mother-son bond that had never really existed? The shame and hurt were a bitter pill to swallow. I felt foolish and exposed, as if he had not only taken my husband's coat, but had also stolen a piece of my heart, a piece I had offered him freely, foolishly. For a week, I grieved. I grieved for the loss of his company, for the death of the fragile hope he had ignited in me. The hollow space inside me felt larger and colder than ever before. I had allowed myself to care, and I had been abandoned. Again, it felt like a punishment for daring to reach for a connection in my old age. Then, just as I was beginning to resign myself to his permanent absence, he came back. It was a Thursday afternoon. I was listlessly sorting through returned books, my heart heavy, when the library door opened and he walked in. He looked terrible. He was thinner than I had ever seen him, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. He wore Robert's coat, but it now seemed to hang on his diminished frame. He saw me and stopped, his expression a mixture of guilt and desperation. He didn't go to his usual chair. He walked directly toward me, his steps slow and deliberate, as if it took all of his energy just to move. He stopped a few feet from the front desk, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of the gray wool coat. "Clara," he began, his voice raspy and low, "I need to talk to you." A maelstrom of emotions swirled within me. Relief so profound it made my knees weak, anger that he had caused me such worry, and a deep, maternal concern that overshadowed everything else. He looked broken. Whatever had happened in the week he was gone had taken a heavy toll. I put down the book I was holding and came out from behind the desk, closing the distance between us. I stopped myself from reaching out to him, though every instinct told me to. First, I needed to understand. "Leo," I said, and my voice was a mixture of all the things I was feeling, a fragile combination of sternness and tenderness. "Where have you been?" I was worried sick. His gaze fell to the floor, unable to meet mine. "I know," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I am so sorry, Clara. I never meant to worry you. I should have called. I should have, I just couldn't." Couldn't, I questioned, the hurt evident in my tone, or didn't want to. The words sounded harsher than I intended, propelled by the week of anxiety and the sting of Martha's cynical warnings. He finally looked up, and the raw pain in his eyes silenced my anger. There were tears glistening there, held back by a will that seemed to be on the verge of shattering. "I couldn't," he repeated, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Something happened. I had to leave town. It was an emergency." My own hurt receded, replaced by the familiar ache of compassion. An emergency? Are you all right? Is your family? I trailed off, realizing how little I knew about his family, or if he even had one. Let's go to the break room, I said, my tone softening completely. You look like you're about to collapse, and you're going to tell me everything. He nodded, a look of immense gratitude washing over his haggard features. I led him into the small, quiet room and sat him down in the same chair he had occupied when he'd arrived soaked from the rain weeks ago. I went through the familiar motions of making him a cup of hot, sweet tea, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind raced. He had come back. He hadn't just vanished. Martha was wrong. Whatever his story was, he was not a con man. My intuition had been right all along. I placed the steaming mug in his trembling hands. "Drink this," I commanded gently. "Then talk." He took a long, slow sip, the warmth of the mug seeming to lend him a small measure of comfort. He stared into the cup for a full minute, gathering his thoughts, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and heavy with exhaustion. "My mother," he began, and then paused, swallowing hard. "She's been sick for a long time. It got worse. A lot worse. Her neighbor called me. The doctor said, they said there wasn't much time left." My heart constricted. The poor boy, all this time he had been carrying this burden alone. "Oh, Leo," I breathed, my hand instinctively covering my own heart. "I am so sorry, is she?" He shook his head, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down his pale cheek. "She's still here, she's a fighter, but it's a matter of days, maybe a week. I came back to get my things in order. I have to go back and be with her. I just couldn't leave without talking to you first. I couldn't leave you thinking I had just run off." "Of course you couldn't," I said, though that was exactly what I had feared. The relief that he hadn't abandoned me was quickly replaced by a profound sadness for his impending loss. To lose your mother when you are so young, it was a pain I couldn't imagine. "When I was home," he continued, his gaze still fixed on the table, "we talked a lot. About her life. About everything. And she told me something I never knew. She told me why she had insisted I move to this specific town." I listened, my entire being focused on his words. A sense of premonition washed over me, a feeling that the pieces of the puzzle were about to shift, to rearrange themselves into a picture I wasn't prepared to see. "She knew you, Clara," he said softly, finally lifting his eyes to mine. They were filled with a meaning I couldn't yet decipher. "She knew you a long, long time ago." The air in the room grew still. My mind went blank, searching through the archives of my memory, flipping through faces from decades past, looking for a connection. "She did," I whispered. "What is her name?" Instead of answering, he reached into the inside pocket of Robert's coat. My coat, and he pulled out something that made my breath catch in my chest. It was the old, leather-bound photo album, the one that had appeared in the donation box. "I have to confess something," he said, his voice thick with shame. "The book donation, that was me. I'm so sorry for the deception. I was scared. I didn't know how to approach you. My mother, she gave me this album. She told me to find you. She thought that if you saw it, you might remember." I stared at the album, then back at his face. The vague sense of familiarity I'd always felt when looking at him suddenly sharpened, came into focus like a lens being adjusted. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't my imagination. It was real. But how? Remember what? I asked, my voice barely audible. "Remember who?" He opened the album on the table between us, turning the brittle page to that first photograph. The picture of the smiling young woman who was me, standing next to the handsome, grinning boy. "She wanted you to remember him," Leo said, his finger gently touching the image of the young man. "Michael O'Connell. He was my grandfather." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs. Michael O'Connell, my friend from college, the boy with the roguish grin, his grandfather. It didn't seem possible. The timeline spun in my head, decades rearranging themselves. Michael would be my age, nearly 70. His children would be in their 40s. And his grandchild would be Leo's age. It was possible. It was entirely, terrifyingly possible. I looked from the photograph of Michael to the face of the young man sitting across from me, and now I could see it. It wasn't in the shape of his face or the color of his eyes. It was in the intensity of his gaze. It was in the way his smile, on the rare occasions that it appeared, had a hint of that same charming lopsidedness. The familiarity wasn't just a feeling, it was a ghost, a genetic echo passed down through generations. Your grandfather. I repeated, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. I knew him. We were friends. In college. I know, Leo said. He talked about you all the time. My mother said he never stopped talking about you, not until the day he died. He's gone, I asked, a strange wave of sadness washing over me for the boy I had once known. Leo nodded. He passed away 10 years ago, a heart attack. It was very sudden. He paused, taking a shaky breath. My mother, she's his daughter, his only child. I leaned back in my chair, my mind struggling to absorb the information. Michael O'Connell's grandson, sitting in my library's break room, wearing my dead husband's coat. The sheer improbability of it was staggering. It felt like a scene from a novel, not from my quiet, predictable life. So your mother, she sent you here, to find me? I asked, trying to understand the motivation behind such a strange, long-distance quest. Yes, he confirmed. It was her dying wish, I suppose. She's been sick for years, and I think she knew she didn't have much time left. She wanted to make sure, she wanted me to find you. She said there was something you needed to know. Something my grandfather made her promise to tell you if she ever got the chance. A story like this is full of twists and turns, and it reminds us how interconnected our lives can be, even across decades. Before we find out what Leo's grandfather wanted me to know, I'd like to take a moment to thank you for being here with Mama Lottie Stories. If you're enjoying this journey, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us to keep sharing these incredible stories with all of you. Now, let's get back to it and unravel this mystery from the past. My mind was a whirlwind of questions. What could Michael possibly have needed to tell me after 50 years? We were just friends, classmates. Our lives had diverged completely after that first year of college. I had fallen in love with Robert, and Michael, I had no idea what had happened to him. I had assumed he had graduated, married, and lived a life as ordinary as my own. Why? I asked, the question encompassing everything. Why me? Why now? Leo looked down at the photo album, his expression deeply sorrowful. Because my grandfather loved you, he said, his voice barely a whisper. My mother said he loved you from the moment he met you. He was just too afraid to tell you. And then you met your husband, and he lost his chance. He regretted it for the rest of his life. The confession hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Michael O'Connell had been in love with me. I searched my memories, trying to see our interactions through this new lens. His easy laughter, the way he always saved me a seat in the study group, the way he looked at me in those photographs, I had interpreted it all as friendship. I had been so wrapped up in my own world, so head over heels for Robert, that I had been completely blind to it. A profound sense of sadness settled over me, a retroactive grief for a love I had never known existed. He told my mother, Leo continued, his voice pulling me from my reverie, that he made a terrible mistake back then. A mistake that affected not just him, but you too. And he made her promise that if anything ever happened to him, she would find you and try to make it right. Make what right? I asked, my confusion deepening. What mistake? Leo took a deep, shuddering breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say next. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding, for forgiveness for a sin that wasn't even his. After you and Robert started dating, he began slowly, choosing his words with immense care, my grandfather was devastated. He did something he was deeply ashamed of. He was young, and he was hurt, and he acted foolishly. He paused, and the silence stretched, thick with anticipation. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the edge of the table. What did he do, Leo? He finally met my gaze, and the words came out in a painful rush. He found out that Robert had applied for the same postgraduate scholarship that he had, a very prestigious one, the one that would have allowed the winner to study abroad for a year. It was a life-changing opportunity, and my grandfather, He sabotaged Robert's application. I stared at him, my mind refusing to process the words. Sabotaged. Robert. I remembered that scholarship. Robert had been so disappointed when he didn't get it. He had been one of the top candidates. The rejection had been a huge blow to his confidence. He never understood why he had been passed over. We had assumed the competition was just too fierce. We had moved on, built our life here. But the memory of that disappointment had always lingered, a small, unanswered question in the story of our lives. How? I whispered, my voice hoarse. How did he sabotage it? I don't know all the details, Leo said, shaking his head. My mother didn't either, just that he got access to the applications, and he removed a key letter of recommendation from Robert's file. He replaced it with a different one, a negative one that he forged. The room began to spin. A forgery, a lie, a single act of jealous cruelty from a boy 50 years ago had altered the entire course of my husband's life, of our life. If Robert had won that scholarship, we would have moved to Europe for a year. He would have pursued a different academic path. We would have become different people. The life I had lived, the house I lived in, the memories I cherished, all of it was built upon the foundation of a lie. He won the scholarship, Leo continued quietly, confirming my unspoken thought. And he went abroad. He met my grandmother there. He said he ran away, hoping to forget you, hoping to forget what he'd done. But he never did. The guilt ate at him for his entire life. He told my mother it was the single greatest regret of his existence, a stain on his soul that he could never wash clean. I was speechless. I felt a surge of white-hot anger on Robert's behalf, a protective rage for the man I had loved, for the opportunity that had been stolen from him. But beneath the anger, there was a profound and aching sadness. For Robert's lost chance, for Michael's lifelong guilt, for the tangled, messy reality of human emotions, of love and jealousy and regret. My mother, Leo said, his voice pulling me back to the present, she tried to find you years ago, after my grandfather died. But she couldn't. You weren't in any of the alumni directories under your maiden name, and she didn't know your married name. She was already sick by then, and she eventually gave up. But when she knew she was dying, it became an obsession. She felt she couldn't rest in peace until she had fulfilled her promise to her father. He looked so tired, so burdened by the weight of his family's history, of a promise made before he was even born. He was just a boy, a messenger sent to deliver a 50-year-old confession. She gave me the album, he said, his hand resting on its worn cover. And your first name, and the name of this town which she found in an old letter. She told me to come here to find a Clara who would have been about the right age. It was a long shot, a crazy quest. I spent weeks just looking. I was about to give up when I saw you in the library. I saw your name tag. I couldn't believe it. But I was too afraid to just walk up to you and tell you this insane story. So I left the album, hoping it would be a bridge. And then I just kept coming back, trying to work up the courage. And then he had called me Mom, the slip of the tongue that had started everything. Now it made a strange kind of sense. In his mind, I was this almost mythical figure from his family's lore, a person his mother had tasked him with finding. I was a destination, a purpose. In his lonely, stressful world, perhaps I had already begun to feel like a maternal figure, a safe harbor. There's more, Leo said, his voice dropping even lower. He reached back into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope, yellowed with age. It was addressed to me, to Clara, in a faded blue ink. My grandfather wrote this for you, years before he died. He gave it to my mother and told her to give it to you if she ever found you. It's his confession, his apology, everything he was too much of a coward to say to you in person. He pushed the envelope across the table. It lay there between us, a relic from another time, a vessel of secrets and regrets. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to touch it. It felt dangerous, as if it contained the power to unravel the very fabric of my past. My mother's last wish, Leo whispered, his eyes pleading with me, was for me to give you this. And to tell you that she is so sorry for the part her father played in your life and for the secret she kept for so long. That's all she wanted, for you to know the truth. I finally reached out, my trembling fingers closing around the old envelope. The paper was brittle beneath my touch, I looked at Leo, at this young man who had carried his family's 50-year-old burden all the way to my doorstep. He was not a grifter. He was not a stray puppy. He was a grandson, fulfilling a promise, a final act of love for his dying mother and his long-dead grandfather. I knew then that my life was inextricably linked with his. The connection I had felt was not just my loneliness reaching out. It was the past, demanding to be heard. And this letter, this confession from a ghost, was the key. I had to read it. I had to know the full truth of what had happened all those years ago, and I had to decide what to do with it. Holding the letter, I looked at Leo, and for the first time, I saw him not as a sad, mysterious boy, but as family. A strange, unexpected, and complicated branch of a family tree I never knew existed. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was not going to let him face his mother's final days alone. The story he had told had changed everything, not just my understanding of the past, but my vision of the future. A future that, it seemed, now included him. The weight of the letter in my hand felt immense, a physical manifestation of 50 years of secrets. I looked across the table at Leo, at the exhaustion and apprehension etched onto his young face. He had completed his mission. He had delivered the message. Now he was just a boy, far from home, watching his mother die. "Leo," I said, my voice filled with a newfound clarity and purpose. "You are not going back to whatever rented room you've been staying in. You are coming home with me. You can stay in the guest room. It's no trouble at all. You need a proper meal and a good night's sleep." He started to protest, shaking his head. "Clara, no, I couldn't possibly. I've already imposed on you so much. I just came to tell you the story, to give you the letter. I caw." "You can and you will," I interrupted, my tone leaving no room for argument. The teacher in me, long dormant, had resurfaced. "You are carrying far too much on your own. You will stay with me while you get your things in order, and then, when you are ready to go back to your mother, I am going with you." His jaw dropped. He stared at me in stunned silence. "Go with me? Why would you do that?" "Because," I said simply, "after what you've just told me, it feels like the right thing to do. Your mother wanted to meet me, to unburden herself of this promise. If she is at the end of her life, then perhaps my being there will bring her some peace. And besides," I added, my voice softening, "no one should have to go through this alone." The fight seemed to go out of him, replaced by a wave of relief so powerful it was palpable. He slumped in his chair, his shoulders finally relaxing from the tense, protective posture he always held. He nodded, unable to speak, his eyes shining with a fresh wave of unshed tears. This time, I knew they were tears of gratitude. That evening, my quiet, empty house was transformed. There was the sound of another person's footsteps on the stairs, the low murmur of conversation in the living room, the smell of a hearty beef stew simmering on the stove instead of my usual solitary bowl of soup. After Leo had eaten, devouring 2 large bowls with the hunger of someone who had been neglecting himself for weeks, I sent him upstairs to get some rest. I knew he was emotionally and physically drained. Alone in the living room, with the grandfather clock ticking its steady rhythm, I sat in Robert's armchair and finally opened the letter. The paper was so brittle I was afraid it would crumble in my hands. The handwriting was a slanted, elegant cursive, the ink faded but still legible. It began, "My dearest Clara." My heart skipped a beat. I took a deep breath and began to read. The letter was long, pages and pages filled with Michael's elegant script. It was a confession, an apology, and a love letter, all woven into one. He wrote of his feelings for me, how he had been captivated by my laughter and my intelligence from the first day he met me. He described his youthful arrogance, his certainty that he had all the time in the world to win me over. And then, he wrote of his devastation when I fell in love with Robert. He described the night he sabotaged the application in painful, self-lacerating detail. He had gained access to the professor's office under the pretense of retrieving a book he had left behind. He found the file, his hands shaking, his heart pounding with a mixture of guilt and a desperate, ugly sense of triumph. He wrote of how he had spent weeks perfecting the forged letter, mimicking the style and signature of one of Robert's lesser-known professors, creating a document that damned with faint praise and hinted at a lack of intellectual rigor. It was a cowardly, despicable act, and he knew it. He didn't make excuses. He laid his shame bare on the page. He wrote, "I won the scholarship, but it was a hollow victory that has haunted me every day of my life since. I ran to Europe, but I could not run from myself. I met a wonderful woman, Leo's grandmother, and I tried to build a life, but the foundation was cracked. It was built on a lie. My love for her was real, but it was always competing with the ghost of you, Clara, and the shadow of my own deceit. I robbed a good man of his future, and in doing so, I poisoned my own." Tears streamed down my face as I read, tears for Robert's stolen opportunity, and tears for the profound, lifelong torment that Michael had endured. It was not a justification, but it was a powerful explanation. It was the story of a young man's terrible mistake, and a lifetime spent paying the price. Toward the end of the letter, his tone shifted. He wrote of his daughter, Leo's mother, Susan. He wrote of the love he had for her, and the burden of the secret he would one day pass on to her. "I have told her this story," he wrote, "not to poison her mind, but to teach her a lesson that I learned too late. That honesty and integrity are the most valuable things we possess. And that love should never be a reason to cause another person harm. My final wish is for you to know the truth. Not because I deserve your forgiveness, I most certainly do not, but because you and Robert deserved a life that was not unknowingly shaped by my jealousy. I hope you had a happy life, Clara. I pray every day that you did. I pray that my selfish act did not diminish the joy you found with him. He was a good man, a better man than me." I finished the letter and let the pages fall into my lap. I sat there for a long time, the silence of the house wrapping around me like a blanket. The anger I had felt earlier was gone, washed away by a current of profound and complicated sorrow. There was no one left to be angry at. Michael was gone. Robert was gone. There were only the consequences, rippling out across half a century, and in the midst of it all was Leo, an innocent in this 50-year-old drama, tasked with carrying the final message. My heart went out to him. I went upstairs and knocked softly on the guest room door. He opened it immediately, as if he had been waiting. He was already in the pajamas I had laid out for him, a pair of Robert's old flannel ones that were far too big for him. "I read the letter," I said softly. He just nodded, his eyes searching my face for a reaction. "Your grandfather was a very eloquent man," I said, a sad smile touching my lips, "and a very tormented one." "My mother said he was the saddest man she ever knew," Leo replied quietly. "Leo," I said, my decision solidifying with every beat of my heart. "We'll leave for your mother in the morning. Pack whatever you need from your apartment. I'll drive. It's the least I can do." And the most I could do. It was the only thing that made sense anymore. I had to see this story through to its end. I had to meet the daughter of the man who had secretly loved me, the woman who had sent her son to find me. I had to close the circle. The drive to Leo's hometown was long and quiet. We spent hours in the car, the landscape of the countryside rolling past us in a blur of winter browns and grays. Leo gave me directions in a soft voice, but mostly, we sat in a comfortable silence. The shared knowledge of the story that connected us was a tangible presence in the car. There was nothing that needed to be said. He slept for part of the way, his head resting against the passenger side window, and in sleep, he looked even younger, more vulnerable. The lines of worry on his face smoothed out, and I could see the boy he must have been before the weight of his mother's illness and his grandfather's secrets had settled on his shoulders. We arrived in the late afternoon at a small, unassuming house in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. It was the kind of place where people lived their whole lives. As we pulled into the driveway, a woman in a nurse's uniform came out of the front door. She introduced herself as Helen, the hospice nurse. "You must be Leo," she said with a kind, weary smile. Then she looked at me with open curiosity. "This is Clara," Leo said, his voice hesitant. "A friend." "She came to help." Helen nodded, her expression revealing nothing but professional acceptance. "Susan is awake," she said. "She's been asking for you. She doesn't have much energy, so the visits have to be short." I let Leo go in first. I waited in the car, my heart pounding with a nervous rhythm. What was I doing here? What would I say to this dying woman, this stranger who held a piece of my past in her hands? After a few minutes, Leo came back out. His face was pale. "She wants to see you," he said. "She knows who you are." I took a deep breath and followed him into the house. It was small and tidy, filled with the quiet, sterile scent of a sick room. In a hospital bed set up in what must have been the living room, a woman lay propped up against a set of pillows. She was shockingly frail, her body withered by her illness, but her eyes, when they opened to look at me, were startlingly bright and intelligent. They were Michael O'Connell's eyes. "Clara," she whispered, her voice a dry, rustling sound. I moved closer to the bed, my feet sinking into the plush carpet. "Yes," I said softly, "I'm Clara." A faint smile touched her lips. It was a beautiful smile, full of a sad, gentle wisdom. "You're just as lovely as he always said you were," she whispered. "Thank you for coming. I can't tell you what it means to me, to know that my son found you, to know that I could keep my promise to my father." "Leo is a wonderful young man," I said, my eyes welling up with tears. "You should be very proud of him." "I am," she breathed, her gaze shifting to her son, who stood by the window, giving us the illusion of privacy. A look of fierce, profound love passed between them. Then she looked back at me. "My father, he was a good man. He made one terrible mistake. It defined him. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive him." I thought of Robert, of his quiet strength and his unwavering love for me. I thought of the happy life we had built together, a life full of small joys and deep contentment. Had Michael's deception altered our path? Yes, but had it ruined our happiness? No, our love had been stronger than that. Our life had been a good one. "There is nothing to forgive," I said, and I was surprised to find that I meant it. The anger and hurt had dissolved, leaving only a sense of peace. "We all make mistakes when we're young. Your father paid for his for 50 years. It's time for it to be laid to rest. It's time for you to be at peace, too." Tears streamed from her eyes, carving paths through the powdered pallor of her skin. "Thank you," she whispered, the words a sigh of profound release. She held out a thin, trembling hand. I took it in mine. Her skin was as fragile as old paper. We stayed like that for a long moment, two women connected by a man they had both loved in different ways, finding a moment of closure at the end of a long and painful story. Susan passed away 2 days later, in her sleep, with Leo holding her other hand. I was in the kitchen, making a pot of tea. I stayed for the funeral, a small, quiet affair attended by a handful of neighbors and friends. I stood beside Leo as he shoveled the first spadeful of earth onto his mother's coffin, my hand resting on his back, offering what little comfort I could. In that moment, standing in that cold, wintry cemetery, I knew that my role in his life was not over. It was just beginning. He was alone in the world now. He was family, my family. After the funeral, we returned to my house. The guest room was no longer the guest room. It was Leo's room. In the weeks that followed, we found a new rhythm, a new kind of normal. He grieved, and I gave him the space to do so, but I also made sure he ate, that he slept, that he didn't drown in his sorrow. We talked for hours about his mother, about his grandfather, about Robert. We shared stories, filling in the 50-year gap between our families. He told me about his mother's quiet courage, her love of gardening, her fierce devotion to her father's memory. I told him about Robert's kindness, his gentle humor, his passion for history. We were weaving our separate pasts into a shared present. One day, Mrs. Gable called from the library. The part-time shelving position had been approved. She wanted to offer it to Leo. A real, paying job, his first one in this new life. I watched as he accepted the offer, a genuine smile, the first I had seen in weeks, spreading across his face. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. A few months later, on a crisp spring morning, I was in the living room, looking through a box of Robert's old photographs, when Leo came and sat beside me. He had the old leather album in his hands. "I was thinking," he said quietly, "that maybe we could put some of Robert's pictures in here too. Mix them in with my grandfather's." I looked at him, my heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it almost overwhelmed me. "What a wonderful idea," I said. We spent the rest of the morning together, carefully curating a new history. We placed a picture of Robert and me on our wedding day next to the picture of a young Michael O'Connell with his arm around my shoulder. We placed a picture of a baby Leo in his mother's arms next to a picture of my own son, Daniel, as a child. It was an impossible family album, a testament to a story that no one else would ever understand. We were bridging the past, healing old wounds, creating something new and whole from the broken pieces of what came before. That evening, as we sat in the living room reading, he looked up from his book. "You know," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes full of a deep and abiding affection, "I'm really glad I found you, Mom." This time, there was no hesitation, no panic, no mistake. It was just a simple statement of fact. And I smiled, a real, contented smile that reached all the way to my soul. "I'm glad you found me too," I said. "I'm glad you're home." My life was no longer quiet. It was no longer orderly. It was filled with the presence of this wonderful young man who was both a grandson and a son to me, a living link to a past I never knew I had. He had come into my life by mistake, a slip of the tongue in a quiet library, but I had come to realize it was never a mistake at all. It was fate. It was a 50-year-old story finally finding its way to the last page. And for the first time in a very long time, I was not lonely. I was home, too. Our new life settled into a rhythm that was both comforting and quietly joyful. The seasons turned, and the vibrant burst of spring deepened into the lush, green laziness of summer. Leo thrived in his job at the library. He was no longer just the boy in the corner armchair. He was a part of the place, his quiet competence and gentle nature earning him the respect of Mrs. Gable and the affection of the regular patrons. He started to smile more, a real, unburdened smile that reached his eyes and reminded me so much of the photograph of his grandfather. He was healing, and in watching him heal, I found a measure of my own healing. The house, which had been silent for so long, was now filled with the small sounds of life. We would have dinner together every evening, our conversations meandering from the books we were reading to the funny things that had happened at the library that day. He would tell me about the ancient history he was so passionate about, his eyes lighting up as he described the rise and fall of empires. I, in turn, would share stories of my teaching days, of my life with Robert, of the son I had raised within these same walls. It was in sharing these stories that we truly became a family, weaving the threads of our separate pasts into a single, strong tapestry. My friendship with Martha continued, though her skepticism about Leo had been replaced by a grudging admiration. All right, you were right," she conceded over lunch one day. "He's a good kid, seems devoted to you, but don't think I'm not keeping an eye on him." I knew her gruffness was just a shield for her own affection for him. She had taken to baking him her famous lemon drizzle cake, claiming she just happened to have an extra. The memory of Michael O'Connell and his letter had found its proper place. It was no longer a shocking revelation that threatened to upend my past, but a sad, poignant story of youthful mistakes and lifelong regret. It had brought Leo into my life, and for that, I was unceasingly grateful. The anger I had felt on Robert's behalf had softened into a deep, abiding peace. Our life together had been good, full, and happy. Nothing could ever change that. Then, one sunny afternoon in late July, the phone rang. It was Daniel. His actual voice, not Sarah's efficient gatekeeping. I felt the familiar flutter of hope and anxiety that always accompanied his rare calls. "Mom, hi, how are you?" he asked, his voice breezy and distant, the sound of a man making a call out of obligation on his commute home. "Daniel, it's so good to hear your voice," I said, genuine warmth flooding my own. "I'm very well, dear, and you? How is work? How is Sarah?" Good, busy as always," he said, the words slightly muffled, as if he was talking on a headset. "Listen, Mom, I'm calling with some news. We've got a little surprise for you." My heart did a little leap. A surprise? Oh, what is it? "Sarah and I have a long weekend coming up at the end of August. We were thinking of driving down, spending a few days with you. It's been too long." I was stunned into silence. A visit, a real multi-day visit. It had been over 2 years since they had last been here, and that had been a brief, whirlwind 24 hours for a cousin's wedding. "Daniel, that's wonderful news." I finally managed to say, my voice thick with emotion. I would love that more than anything. Great, he said, his tone relieved, as if he had expected me to object. We'll probably get in late on that Friday and head back Monday afternoon. We can make some proper plans closer to the time. I just wanted to give you a heads up. Of course, dear, I'll look forward to it. I'll make up your old room. We can have all your favorite meals. I was already planning, my mind racing with recipes and cleaning schedules. Sounds good, Mom. Okay, I'm pulling into the garage. Gotta run. Love you. I love you too, Daniel, I said, but the line was already dead. I hung up the phone, a wide, genuine smile on my face. My son was coming home for a whole weekend. I couldn't wait to tell Leo. I turned from the phone and he was standing in the doorway of the living room, a book in his hand. He must have overheard the conversation. But the expression on his face was not one of shared joy. It was one of quiet, profound anxiety. His smile was small and tight, his eyes clouded with worry. That's wonderful news, Clara, he said, but his voice lacked its usual warmth. You must be so excited. My own happiness faltered as I looked at him. I suddenly saw the situation through his eyes. This was his home now, his safe place. And into that safe place was coming my son, the biological heir, the rightful occupant of the space Leo now filled. I had talked about Daniel, of course, but for Leo, he was an abstraction. Now, that abstraction was about to become a reality. I am excited, I said, walking towards him. But Leo, I want you to know something. This is your home, you belong here. Daniel's visit doesn't change that, not one bit. He gave me a grateful but unconvinced look. I know, he said, though his tone said otherwise. But I feel like I should probably make myself scarce. I can stay with a friend from work or find a cheap motel for the weekend. It's his home. He shouldn't have to feel like there's a stranger intruding. The thought of him leaving, even for a few days, sent a sharp pang through my chest. The idea of him feeling like an intruder in his own home was unbearable. Absolutely not, I said, my voice firm. Leo, you are not a stranger. You are my family. I want him to meet you. I want him to see how happy I am, how much you mean to me. But even as I said the words, a seed of my own anxiety began to sprout. How would Daniel react? My son was a good man, but he was also pragmatic, judgmental, and, since his father's death, fiercely, sometimes suffocatingly, protective of me. He treated me as a fragile object, a problem to be managed from a distance. He would not understand who Leo was. He would not understand our connection. He would see a young, unemployed man living in his widowed mother's house, and he would jump to the most cynical of conclusions. He would see the grifter that Martha had once warned me about. In the weeks leading up to the visit, a subtle tension settled over our peaceful home. I tried to pretend everything was normal, but I found myself cleaning with a frantic energy, as if a spotless house could somehow ward off my son's judgment. I rehearsed conversations in my head, trying to find the perfect way to explain Leo's presence, a way that would sound reasonable and not like the ramblings of a lonely old woman who had adopted a stray. Leo, for his part, became quieter, more withdrawn. He spent more time in his room, and I noticed he was meticulously tidying his belongings, as if preparing for a military inspection. He was trying to minimize his presence, to make himself smaller, and it broke my heart. We need to talk about this, I said one evening, a few days before their scheduled arrival. We were in the kitchen, washing and drying the dinner dishes, a comfortable ritual that had become one of my favorite parts of the day. He stopped wiping the plate in his hand, his gaze fixed on the soapy water in the sink. There's nothing to talk about, he said quietly. I'll be polite. I'll stay out of the way. It will be fine. No, I said, turning to face him fully. It's not fine that you feel you have to hide in your own home. Daniel can be difficult. He worries about me. He might not understand at first, but he is my son, and I love him. And you are my family, and I love you. My greatest wish is for the two of you to, if not like each other, then to at least respect each other's place in my life. He finally looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the depth of his insecurity. What if he asks me to leave? He whispered. What if he convinces you that I'm bad for you? I reached out and took the dishcloth from his hand, placing it on the counter. I took his hands in mine. They were cold. "Leo, look at me," I said, waiting until he met my eyes. "No one can convince me that you are bad for me. You have brought more joy and light into my life in the past few months than I have felt in years. Do you understand that? This is your home." "Nothing and no one is going to change that. I will not allow it." My words seemed to land, to offer him a measure of the reassurance he so desperately needed. He squeezed my hands, a silent thank you. But the apprehension still lingered in the air between us, a storm cloud on the horizon of what should have been a happy family reunion. The day of their arrival, the tension was a thick, palpable thing. I had cooked all of Daniel's childhood favorites: pot roast, creamy mashed potatoes, and a deep dish apple pie for dessert. The house smelled of home and welcome. Leo had offered to go out for the evening to give us time alone, but I had insisted he stay. We would face this together as a family. Their car, a sleek, expensive-looking sedan, pulled into the driveway just as dusk was settling. I stood on the porch, my heart beating a nervous tattoo against my ribs, with Leo standing just behind me in the shadows of the doorway. The car doors opened, and out stepped my son and his wife. Daniel looked older than I remembered, his hair starting to thin at the temples, his face etched with the stress of his demanding career. Sarah was as polished as ever, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, her stylish dress unwrinkled despite the long drive. "Mom." Daniel called out, a smile spreading across his face as he walked towards me. He wrapped me in a brief, stiff hug. "It's so good to see you. You look great." "You too, dear," I said, holding on for a moment longer than he seemed comfortable with. Sarah also gave me a quick, air kiss on the cheek. "Clara, the house looks wonderful. And something smells amazing." Their eyes, inevitably, were drawn to the figure standing in the doorway. I felt Leo tense behind me. I turned and took his arm, gently pulling him forward into the soft glow of the porch light. "Daniel, Sarah," I said, my voice bright and steady. "There's someone I'd like you to meet. This is Leo. He's a dear friend, and he lives here with me." I watched as Daniel's smile froze on his face. His eyes flickered from Leo's face down to his simple clothes and then back up, a quick, dismissive assessment. His gaze was cold, suspicious. Sarah's polite smile remained, but it became fixed, her eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. "Leo," Daniel said, his voice stripped of its earlier warmth. He did not extend his hand. "I see." The two words were laden with a mountain of unspoken judgment. In that moment, I knew that my anxiety had not been misplaced. This was not going to be a happy family reunion. It was going to be a battle. And the prize, it seemed, was the very definition of my life, my home, and my family. The dinner that followed was one of the most excruciatingly tense meals of my life. I tried to foster a sense of warmth and conviviality, asking Daniel and Sarah about their work, their friends, their recent vacation. They answered in polite, clipped sentences, their attention constantly, subtly shifting to Leo, who sat beside me, eating his food in a state of near-perfect silence. He was so tense he barely seemed to be breathing. I could feel the waves of disapproval rolling off my son from across the table. Daniel was observing Leo with the focused intensity of a hawk watching a mouse, his eyes missing nothing. "So, Leo," Daniel said finally, his fork clinking against his plate as he set it down. The question was posed casually, but it felt like the beginning of an interrogation. "My mother tells me you're a dear friend. How long have you known each other?" Leo swallowed the bite of pot roast in his mouth, his knuckles white where he gripped his fork. "A few months now," he answered, his voice quiet but steady. "We met at the public library where your mother volunteers." "The library," Daniel repeated, a small, cynical smile playing on his lips. "And you live here now, in my father's house." The possessiveness in his tone was a sharp jab, aimed as much at me as it was at Leo. "Daniel," I interjected, my voice sharper than I intended. "It is my house, and Leo is my guest, my permanent guest." "Right," Daniel said, his eyes still locked on Leo. "And what is it you do, Leo, for work?" "I have a part-time job at the library, shelving books," Leo replied, meeting Daniel's gaze directly for the first time. There was a quiet dignity in his demeanor that made me proud. I also had a job washing dishes, but I left that to help Clara more around the house. The garden had gotten a bit out of hand, and there were a few things that needed fixing up. Sarah let out a small, almost inaudible scoff. "A handyman, then," she murmured into her wine glass, just loud enough for everyone to hear. The insult was clear. They were painting him as a user, a drifter who had attached himself to a lonely old woman for room and board. The unfairness of it made my blood boil. They didn't see the kind, gentle soul who read history books and grieved for his mother. They saw a caricature, a threat. "Leo has been an incredible help to me," I said, my voice trembling with a barely suppressed anger. "And more than that, he has been a wonderful companion. This house was terribly empty before he came." The confession slipped out, a raw admission of the loneliness I had so carefully hidden from my son for years. Daniel's expression hardened. I think he heard an accusation in my words, a criticism of his own neglect. "Well, Mom, if you were lonely, you should have told us," he said, his voice taking on a condescending, parental tone. "We could have looked into some assisted living communities for you, places with social activities, other people your age." The suggestion was so breathtakingly dismissive that I was left speechless. He didn't want to solve my loneliness, he wanted to outsource it, to put me in a place where I would no longer be his problem. He wanted to tidy my life away, just as he tidied everything else. The rest of the meal passed in a thick, choking silence. After I had cleared the plates, Sarah announced that she had a headache from the long drive and was going to bed. It was a transparent excuse to escape the oppressive atmosphere. Daniel lingered, helping me carry the last of the dishes to the kitchen, while Leo, taking the hint, quietly excused himself and went up to his room. Once we were alone, the pretense of civility dropped completely. Daniel leaned against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of stern disapproval. "Okay, Mom," he said, his voice low and serious. "What is really going on here? Who is this kid?" "I told you who he is," I replied, my back to him as I began to load the dishwasher with more force than was necessary. "He is my friend. He is my family." "Family?" he scoffed. "Mom, you've known him for a few months. You let him move into your house. A boy with no job to speak of, no prospects. Don't you see what this looks like? He's taking advantage of you." I turned around to face him, my hands dripping with dishwater. "What it looks like to you is not what it is," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "You have not been here, Daniel. You have not seen how I have lived for the past 5 years since your father died. You call me once a month, you visit once every 2 years, and you think you have the right to come in here and pass judgment on my life, on my choices." He had the grace to look slightly ashamed, but it was quickly replaced by a stubborn self-righteousness. "I'm your son," he said, as if that explained everything. "I have a right to be concerned. You are a vulnerable, elderly woman living alone." "I am not a vulnerable, elderly woman," I snapped, my voice rising. "I am a person, and I was living alone, but I am not alone anymore. And I will not have you come into my home and treat Leo with such disrespect. He has been through more hardship than you can possibly imagine. He is a good, kind, honorable young man." "Hardship?" Daniel's cynical smile returned. "What sob story did he feed you?" That was it, that was the final straw. The dismissal of Leo's pain, the pain I had witnessed firsthand, was an insult I could not tolerate. "You know what, Daniel?" I said, my voice suddenly calm, cold, and clear. "I am not going to justify my life to you. Leo's story is his to tell, not mine to defend against your baseless suspicions. He is here in this house because I want him here. He is a part of my life because he brings me happiness. You can either accept that and treat him with the basic human decency he deserves, or you and Sarah can leave first thing in the morning. The choice is yours." I had never spoken to my son like that before. I had always been the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over rough edges, the one who swallowed her own feelings to keep things pleasant. But the woman who stood in the kitchen that night was different. She had found her voice. She had found something worth fighting for. Daniel stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, utterly shocked by my ultimatum. He saw a stranger in front of him, a mother he did not recognize. He saw a woman who was no longer fragile, no longer lonely, and no longer willing to be managed. He saw a woman who had, finally, chosen her own happiness over his approval. He stood there for a long moment, the silence of the kitchen punctuated only by the ticking of the clock in the hall, and I knew that whatever he decided next would define our relationship for the rest of our lives. The silence that followed my ultimatum was profound, a vacuum in which 50 years of unspoken family dynamics seemed to warp and collapse. Daniel's face cycled through a series of emotions: shock, indignation, and finally, a deep, wounded confusion. He looked at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. The idea that his approval was not the ultimate prize, that his judgment was not the final word in my own home, was a concept so alien to him that he clearly had no framework to process it. He started, then stopped, shaking his head. I can't even talk to you when you're like this, so emotional, unreasonable. He fell back on the old, familiar dismissals, the words he had always used to shut down any feeling of mine that was inconvenient to him. I'm going to bed. He turned and walked out of the kitchen without another word, his retreat a clear sign that he had lost control of the situation and was fleeing the battlefield. I stood there for a long time, my hands gripping the cold, wet edge of the sink, my body trembling with the adrenaline of the confrontation. The anger began to subside, leaving behind a deep, hollow fear. Had I gone too far? Had I just severed the already frayed thread that connected me to my only son? I sank into a kitchen chair, the scent of apple pie and betrayal hanging heavy in the air. The house was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the tense, waiting silence of a truce, not a peace. Upstairs, in the room that had once been Daniel's, he and Sarah were having a very different conversation. Daniel paced the floor, his movements agitated, his voice a low, furious whisper. Did you hear her? Did you hear what she said? She chose him. Some kid she picked up at the library. She chose him over me, over her own son. Sarah, who was sitting on the edge of the bed, methodically applying a night cream to her face, sighed. She was the pragmatist in their relationship, the one who navigated life with a cool, strategic mind that was often a foil to Daniel's emotional, ego-driven reactions. She didn't choose him over you, Daniel, she said, her voice calm and measured. She gave you a choice. She told you to treat the boy with decency or leave. That's a boundary, not a betrayal. A boundary? He scoffed, whirling around to face her. He's a con artist, Sarah, can't you see it? He's wormed his way in here, feeding her some sob story, and now he's living for free in a house that's worth a fortune. My inheritance, our inheritance. And what is your plan, exactly? Sarah asked, capping her jar of cream and looking up at him, her expression unreadable. To yell at her until she kicks him out, to force her hand. All that will accomplish is her digging in her heels and resenting you for it. Think for a minute. The will was most likely finalized years ago. Throwing a tantrum isn't going to change it. In fact, if you alienate her, you might just give her a reason to change it in his favor. Her words hit their mark. Daniel stopped pacing, the financial logic of her argument cutting through his emotional outrage. So what am I supposed to do? He asked, his voice full of frustration. Just stand by and watch this parasite leech off my mother. You observe, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You play the part of the concerned, loving son, you be polite to the boy, you gather information, you find out what his story really is. People like that always slip up. Give him enough rope and he'll hang himself. But if you go in there like a bull in a china shop, you'll just smash everything to pieces and she will blame you, not him. Downstairs, I finally pushed myself up from the kitchen table. My house felt strange, occupied by a conflict it hadn't known in years. I checked the locks on the doors, a nightly ritual that suddenly felt different, less about security and more about sealing us all inside this pressure cooker of a weekend. I went into the living room and sat in Robert's armchair, the familiar comfort of it doing little to soothe my frayed nerves. I thought of Robert. He would have handled this so differently. He would have listened. He would have been kind. He would have seen the goodness in Leo instantly, just as I had. The thought of my husband, of his gentle strength, solidified my resolve. I had done the right thing. With that thought, I went upstairs. I paused outside Daniel and Sarah's room. I could hear the low murmur of their voices, but I couldn't make out the words. A part of me, the old mother, the peacemaker, wanted to knock, to apologize, to smooth everything over. But a stronger, newer part of me kept walking, right past their door to the one at the end of the hall. I knocked softly on Leo's door. He opened it a crack. He was fully dressed, and I saw his worn backpack sitting on the bed behind him, half filled with his clothes. My heart sank. "I was just about to," he began, his voice a miserable whisper. "You will do no such thing," I said, pushing the door open gently and stepping inside. "You heard us arguing." It wasn't a question. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I am so sorry, Clara. This is my fault. I'm tearing your family apart. I'll leave in the morning before they wake up. It will be better for everyone." "Better for whom?" I asked, my voice fierce. "Better for Daniel, so he can continue to believe he runs my life. Better for Sarah, so she doesn't have to suffer the inconvenience of a family squabble. It will not be better for me. Leo, listen to me. My family was already apart. The distance between me and my son has been growing for years. We just never spoke of it. You didn't cause this rift. You just brought it out into the light. You are not the problem." I walked over and placed my hand on his half-packed bag. "This is your home. Now unpack this bag. That is an order." He looked up at me, his eyes shining with a mixture of disbelief and a profound, bone-deep relief. He nodded slowly, a silent promise. "Okay, Mom," he whispered, the word full of its true meaning for the first time in front of a third party, even one who couldn't hear. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. He was my son, too, and I would fight for him. The next morning, the air in the kitchen was so thick with unspoken resentments you could have cut it with a knife. Sarah, true to the strategy she had likely laid out for Daniel, was a model of forced pleasantry. She complimented the coffee, commented on the beautiful morning light filtering through the window, and asked Leo polite, meaningless questions about the library. Leo, taking his cue from me, answered with a quiet, unshakable dignity. Daniel, however, was clearly struggling with his new role as a covert operative. He was sullen and silent, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between me and Leo as if he was trying to solve a particularly difficult puzzle. I was the very picture of maternal calm, moving about the kitchen with a serene purposefulness that I did not feel. I was polite, but I was not yielding. There was a new boundary around me, a line that I had drawn in the sand, and everyone at the table could feel it. After the tense, mostly silent breakfast, I stood up and made an announcement. "Well," I said, collecting my plate, "I'm afraid I have to leave you all for a little while. I have my Saturday morning shift at the library. It's the children's story hour, and I can't miss it. The kids count on me." Daniel looked up, shocked. "You're leaving? You're just going to go to the library?" He had clearly expected a weekend of focused attention, of me being at his beck and call. "That's right," I said, smiling sweetly. "I have a life, Daniel, a routine. I'm not going to abandon it simply because you're here. Leo knows where everything is if you need anything. There's leftover pot roast in the fridge for lunch. I should be back around 1. It was a deliberate act, a strategic move of my own. I was showing him that my life did not revolve around him. I was showing him that I trusted Leo implicitly, and I was forcing him and Leo into the same space, without me there to act as a buffer. It was a risk, but it was one I had to take. I gave Leo a quick, reassuring glance, which he returned with a small, nervous nod, and then I left. The drive to the library was filled with a nervous energy. I kept imagining all the things that could go wrong. A shouting match. An ultimatum. But I pushed the thoughts away. I had to trust Leo. I had to trust the choice I had made. Back at the house, a tense silence descended. Sarah took her laptop out to the patio to catch up on some work, effectively removing herself from the situation. Daniel prowled the downstairs rooms like a caged tiger, his restless energy filling the quiet space. He ended up in the backyard, where Leo was methodically weeding the rose bushes that grew along the back fence. Daniel stood on the porch, watching him for a long time before he finally spoke. "So?" he said, his voice laced with a condescending edge. "You're the gardener now, too." Leo looked up, shielding his eyes from the sun with a dirt-caked hand. He did not rise to the bait. "I enjoy it," he said, his voice even. The roses needed some attention. They were getting choked by the weeds. My father planted those roses, Daniel said, the words a clear, territorial claim. The day I was born. I know, Leo replied, turning back to his task. Clara told me, they're beautiful. It's a privilege to take care of them. His simple, respectful answer seemed to disarm Daniel. It was not the response of a usurper trying to erase the past, but of someone who understood and valued it. Daniel was silent for another moment, then he changed his tack, his voice becoming hard and direct. Look, I don't know what your game is, he started, walking down the steps and onto the grass. But I want you to understand something. My mother is a sweet, trusting woman. She's been lonely since my dad died. She is not a meal ticket. She is not a charity case for you to exploit. Leo slowly rose to his feet, wiping his hands on his jeans. He was several inches taller than Daniel, but his posture was not threatening. It was simply solid. I have never asked your mother for anything except a chance, he said, his voice low and firm. Everything I have, she has offered. I pay her back in the only way I can right now, with my time, my work, and my gratitude. I am not exploiting her. I am caring for her, just as she cares for me. It's what families do. You are not her family, Daniel spat, the words full of venom. I think she would disagree with you, Leo said quietly. Frustrated, Daniel turned and stalked back into the house, slamming the screen door behind him. The conversation had not gone as he planned. He had expected a cowering, defensive boy he could easily intimidate. Instead, he had found a young man of quiet, unshakable substance. He threw himself onto the sofa in the living room, his mind racing. He was losing. He was losing control, and he didn't know why. His eyes fell on the coffee table. Sitting there, next to a stack of my magazines, was the old, leather-bound photo album, the one Leo and I had so carefully curated. Daniel, looking for a distraction, for some clue to the mystery of his mother's new life, picked it up. He opened it to a random page. He saw a picture of himself as a gap-toothed 7-year-old, sitting on his father's shoulders. He smiled, a brief flicker of a happy memory. He turned the page, and then he froze. On the next page was a picture he had never seen before. It was of a young man he didn't recognize, with sad, intense eyes holding a baby. Next to it was a formal portrait of his own father, Robert, from his university days. He frowned, confused. He turned another page. There was a photo of me and Robert on our wedding day. And on the facing page, a photo of me as a college girl, my arm linked with that of another young man, a handsome, smiling stranger. He flipped through the pages with increasing confusion and alarm. It was a bizarre, nonsensical collage of his own family's history intertwined with the history of a family he did not know. It felt like a violation, a rewriting of his own past. Who were these people? Why were their memories physically inserted between the most sacred images of his own childhood? Just then, Leo came back inside, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He saw Daniel sitting there, the album open on his lap, a look of thunderous bewilderment on his face. Daniel looked up, his eyes blazing with a new, sharper kind of suspicion, one born not just of jealousy, but of a deep, profound confusion. He held up the album, the pages falling open to the impossible juxtapositions of their two families. "What the hell?" Daniel demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Is this?" Leo stopped in his tracks, his heart sinking. He had forgotten the album was on the coffee table. He had grown so accustomed to its presence, to the strange and beautiful narrative it now told, that he had failed to see it for what it was to an outsider, a bizarre and deeply suspicious object. Daniel's face was a mask of cold fury, his finger pointing at the photograph of Michael O'Connell and me. "Who is this man?" Daniel demanded, his voice dangerously low. "And why is his picture in my family's album?" Leo's mind raced. He had promised me he would let me be the one to tell Daniel the story, in my own time, in my own way. But that option was gone now. The past was open on the coffee table, exposed and demanding an explanation. He knew that a lie or an evasion would be disastrous. It would only confirm every one of Daniel's suspicions. He had to tell the truth, or at least a part of it. "That," Leo said, his voice quiet and steady as he walked slowly into the room, "was my grandfather." Daniel stared at him, his mouth falling slightly open. Of all the possible answers he might have imagined, this was clearly not one of them. Your grandfather. He repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. What are you talking about? Why would a picture of your grandfather be next to a picture of my mother? Leo took a deep breath. This was the moment, the precipice. Because they knew each other, he said, choosing his words with immense care. A long time ago, in college, they were friends. Daniel looked from the picture of the smiling young people to Leo's serious, sad face, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than anger appeared in his eyes. It was a sliver of confusion, an acknowledgement that the situation was far more complex than the simple narrative of a con artist and a lonely widow he had constructed in his mind. Friends, Daniel scoffed, though the word lacked its earlier conviction. If they were just friends, why is this shrine sitting on my mother's coffee table? It's not a shrine, Leo said, his voice firm but not aggressive. It's a story. Your mother, she has been helping me understand my family's past, and in doing so, we discovered it was connected to hers. He decided to omit the part about the sabotage, the letter, the 50 years of guilt. That was my story to tell, my husband's story. But the connection, the shared history, that was the truth he could offer. My mother passed away a few months ago. Before she died, she sent me here to find Clara. She wanted to close a circle, to deliver a message from my grandfather. The mention of his mother's death, spoken with such raw, unadorned grief, had a palpable effect on the room. It was a truth so stark and painful that it cut through Daniel's layers of cynicism. For a moment, he wasn't a suspicious son protecting his inheritance. He was just a man, confronted with the profound, universal sorrow of another. The album, Leo continued, gesturing towards it, was my grandfather's. Clara, she helped me go through it. And we decided to add her pictures, Robert's pictures, your pictures, to honor all of it. The past. All the connections we never knew we had. Daniel was silent. He looked down at the album again, but this time his gaze was different. It was less accusatory, more searching. He was reevaluating everything he thought he knew. The story was still unbelievable, still strange, but it had the undeniable ring of a complicated, messy truth, not a simple, calculated lie. He had no more questions. He just sat there, staring at the ghosts on the pages, the pieces of his own life now irrevocably intertwined with a story he had never imagined. It was into this charged, silent tableau that I walked when I returned from the library. I came in through the back door, humming a tune from Story Hour, feeling lighter than I had in days. I had done it. I had set my boundaries, and the world had not ended. Then I saw them. Daniel on the sofa, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, staring at the open album. Leo standing a few feet away, his posture rigid, his expression one of weary resignation. My heart stopped. What's going on? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Daniel looked up at me, his eyes filled with a raw, bewildering pain. He held up the album. Mom, he said, and his voice was not angry anymore. It was just lost. Who was Michael O'Connell? I looked at Leo, and he gave me a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He had not told the whole story. He had left the heart of it for me. I walked into the room, took off my coat, and sat down in the armchair across from my son. The moment I had been dreading and rehearsing for weeks was finally here. Michael O'Connell, I began, my voice clear and calm, was a friend. He was your father's classmate, and he was Leo's grandfather. I paused, letting the impossible words settle in the room. And he was a young man who made a terrible mistake, a mistake that changed the course of all of our lives, and a mistake for which he spent the rest of his life trying to atone. And then I told him. I told him everything. I told him about the scholarship, about the forged letter, about the love Michael had confessed to on pages I had read 50 years too late. I told him about Susan's dying wish, about Leo's quest, about the letter that now sat in a locked box in my bedroom. I laid the entire, unbelievable 50-year-old story out in the quiet, sunlit living room of the house that Robert had bought, in the life that had been shaped by a secret I had never known. As I spoke, I watched my son's face. The anger, the suspicion, the cynicism, all of it melted away, replaced by a profound, heart-wrenching sadness. It was the sadness of a man who was not only learning a secret about his parents, but was also being forced to confront the fundamental flaws in his own understanding of the world. His mother was not a naive old woman. This young man was not a parasite. And his own father, the man he idolized, had been the victim of a quiet, devastating injustice that he had carried with him unknowingly for his entire life. When I finished, there was a long, heavy silence. Daniel just stared at his hands, his face pale. Sarah had come in from the patio at some point, drawn by the gravity of the conversation, and was now standing by the doorway, her usual composure completely gone, her expression one of stunned disbelief. Finally, Daniel looked up, not at me, but at Leo. His eyes were red-rimmed. "Your mother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She knew all this. Your grandfather told her." Leo nodded. He told her everything. He wanted her to understand the importance of integrity, the weight of our actions. He carried that guilt with him always. Daniel stood up. He walked over to where Leo was standing and he stopped in front of him. I held my breath. I had no idea what he would do. Then, to my utter astonishment, he slowly, hesitantly extended his hand. "My father," Daniel said, his voice cracking, "was the most honorable man I have ever known. He deserved that scholarship. What your grandfather did was unforgivable. But he was a kid, a stupid, jealous kid, and he paid for it. And you and your mother. You've carried this burden that wasn't even yours to carry. I'm sorry. I am so sorry for how I've treated you." Leo looked at the outstretched hand, his own eyes filling with tears. He took it. "I'm the one who's sorry, Daniel," he said, "for everything." They stood there for a moment, the sons of two men who had been rivals 50 years ago, shaking hands in a living room filled with the ghosts of their shared past. It was a moment of grace, of forgiveness, of a profound and unexpected healing. Sarah came forward and put a hand on her husband's arm, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She looked at me, a look that conveyed more apology and understanding than any words could have. The rest of the weekend was a revelation. It was as if the lancing of that 50-year-old wound had drained all the poison from our family. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, thoughtful tenderness. Daniel was different. He looked at me with a new respect, a new understanding. He saw me not as a problem to be managed, but as a person with a complex, hidden history, a woman of unexpected strength. He spoke to Leo with a genuine curiosity, asking him about his mother, about his studies, about his hopes for the future. He was finally seeing the young man I saw, kind, intelligent, and deeply honorable. On the last day of their visit, Daniel found me alone in the garden, tending to the rose bushes. He stood beside me for a long time, just watching my hands as I pruned the dead blossoms. "Mom," he said finally, his voice soft, "I've been a terrible son." I stopped my work and looked at him. "No, you haven't," I said gently. "You've just been busy and worried, and you didn't understand." "That's no excuse," he said, shaking his head. "I haven't been here for you, not really. And I come in here and I see you've built this new life for yourself. You're happy. And Leo, he's a good kid, Mom. He really is. He's good for you." He paused, swallowing hard. "The truth is, I was jealous. I was jealous that he was here, with you, in my place." It was the most honest, vulnerable thing he had said to me in years. I reached out and took his hand, my gardening glove rough against his smooth skin. "There is no your place, Daniel," I said. "There is just the place in my heart, and my heart is big enough for both of you. It always will be." When they left that afternoon, the farewell was completely different from the strained greeting of a few days earlier. Daniel hugged me tightly, a real, lingering hug that spoke volumes. "I'll call more, Mom," he whispered in my ear. "I promise, and we'll be back soon, for Christmas, all of us." He pulled away and then turned to Leo, clapping him on the shoulder. "You take care of her," he said, and it was not a threat but a request, a passing of a torch. As their car pulled out of the driveway, Leo and I stood on the porch, waving until it was out of sight. The air felt clean, fresh, as if a long and violent storm had finally passed, leaving a quiet, sunlit peace in its wake. I turned to Leo, a wide, joyful smile on my face. "Well," I said, "that was eventful." He laughed, a real, unburdened laugh. "That's one word for it." We went back inside, the house feeling calm and truly ours again. It was no longer a place of secrets and unspoken tensions. It was a home filled with an impossible, improbable, and absolutely wonderful family. A family born from a 50-year-old mistake, a slip of the tongue in a quiet library, and the stubborn, persistent, and ultimately healing power of love. My life was no longer small or lonely. It was vast, and it was full. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that the best chapters were still to come.